Greg Valentine just revealed 5 wrestlers he hates. And honestly, some of these names are seriously unexpected. So without wasting any more time, let's jump right in and see what all the hate is about. 1. Ronnie Garvin. It all started in the WWF when Garvin came in and immediately clashed with Valentine's old school mentality. Greg had always seen himself as a technician, deliberate, methodical, and ruthless when needed. Garvin, on the other hand, was a brawler through and through. He didn't just work snug, he hit hard, really hard, and that's where things got personal. Valentine started feeling like Garvin wasn't respecting him in the ring. Their matches turned into real fights at times, with both men exchanging legitimate shots, trying to prove who was tougher. The tension hit a boiling point during their retirement storyline, where Garvin forced Valentine out of action temporarily. Behind the scenes, Greg hated that angle. He felt like the company was letting Garvin embarrass him, especially since Garvin was the one who retired him in the storyline. To make matters worse, when Valentine finally returned, Garvin didn't back down. He kept mocking him, even taking on the role of a referee just to mess with him. Every time Garvin cost him a match or got in his face, Valentine's anger grew deeper. Their eventual blow-off match, the famous submission match at the 1990 Royal Rumble, was brutal. It wasn't just acting, it was personal. Each man wanted to hurt the other for real. Even fans could tell the hatred felt genuine, and honestly, it was. Afterward, Valentine admitted he never liked Garvin. Not his attitude, not his style, not his stiff hits. He respected his toughness, sure, but he couldn't stand the guy. For Greg, Garvin crossed the line between professional competition and personal disrespect. And in wrestling, once someone does that, there's no going back. To this day, that rivalry stands out as one of the most real and heated grudges of Greg Valentine's career. 2. Shawn Michaels. Greg Valentine didn't hold back when he said, "I hated Shawn Michaels." It wasn't for show or to stir drama. You could hear the bitterness in his voice, and to understand why, you need to look at how different the two men were, not just in the ring, but in what they stood for. Valentine came from the old school generation, where wrestlers were supposed to look tough, act tough, and focus on the fight. He grew up under the influence of his father, Johnny Valentine, and men who believed wrestling was about toughness and realism, not flash. Then along came Shawn Michaels, who was young, loud, confident, and proud of being the complete opposite. To Greg, Shawn represented a shift in the business that he simply couldn't respect. The tension began in the early 1990s when Shawn started climbing from the rockers to becoming the Heartbreak Kid. Fans loved him, but many veterans like Valentine saw arrogance in him. They felt Shawn didn't show enough respect to the people who paved the way for him. Greg saw him as a guy who cared more about style, dancing, imposing than the actual art of wrestling. For a man like Valentine, that attitude felt like an insult to everything he and his generation worked for. Shawn had a reputation for being difficult and hot-headed. There were stories about his ego, his conflicts with others, and his unwillingness to take advice from veterans. Valentine watched all that and saw someone who thought he was above the business. To him, that kind of behavior broke the unspoken rule of wrestling. You respect the ones who came before you. Even when Shawn turned his life around years later and became known as one of the greatest of all time, Greg didn't change his stance. He admitted that Shawn was talented, but he still couldn't bring himself to like him. 3. Billy Jack Haynes. Greg Valentine's feelings toward Billy Jack Haynes were anything but friendly. When his Top 10 Shoots compilation featured a segment about Haynes, it was clear that there was real tension between them. Greg didn't just bring up Billy Jack's name for entertainment. The mention came with a tone that hinted at frustration, old grudges, and a sense that things between them had never been right from the start. Their issues likely began back in the mid to late 1980s when both men were working in the same circles. Billy Jack Haynes had the kind of build and intensity that made him stand out instantly. He was strong, fiery, and proud of his reputation as a legitimate tough guy. But that same confidence often came across as ego, especially to veterans like Greg Valentine, who believed in earning respect through time and hard work, not loud personalities or big talk. In Valentine's eyes, Billy Jack wasn't just cocky, he was unpredictable. Greg had spent his whole career working with professionals who understood the balance between toughness and control. But Haynes had a habit of crossing that line. He'd throw stiff punches, ignore cues, and sometimes make matches feel more like real fights than performances. To Valentine, that wasn't professionalism, it was recklessness. Behind the scenes, things didn't improve. Billy Jack had a reputation for being hot-tempered and outspoken. He often clashed with management and other wrestlers, and Greg didn't have much patience for that kind of behavior. He believed in keeping the locker room respectful and united, while Haynes seemed to thrive on confrontation. There were stories that Billy Jack would argue over finishes or complain about pay, and for old-school veterans like Greg, that was the ultimate sign of disrespect. By the time both men moved on from the WWF, whatever mutual respect might have existed was long gone. Greg never minced words when asked about Haynes in later interviews. You could tell there was no love lost there. To him, Billy Jack was one of those wrestlers who had the talent and the look, but lacked the discipline and respect that made the business work. 4. Paul Orndorff. Greg Valentine's feelings toward Paul Orndorff were complicated, but one thing was clear. There was no love lost between them. In several of Valentine's shoot interviews, his tone shifts noticeably when Orndorff's name comes up. You can sense that something personal lingered beneath the surface. Both men were from that old-school generation of tough wrestlers who took pride in their physicality and toughness. They weren't flashy, they were fighters, but that similarity might have been the very thing that caused the clash. Greg and Paul were both proud, stubborn, and set in their ways. Neither man liked backing down, and when two strong personalities like that share a locker room, tension is almost guaranteed. The trouble likely started during their time working together in the 1980s. Paul Orndorff, known as Mr. Wonderful, had a reputation for having a quick temper and a huge ego to match his impressive physique. He was confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance, and Greg Valentine wasn't the type to tolerate that. Valentine had come up in an era where respect had to be earned through years of paying dues, not through charisma or self-promotion. To him, Orndorff acted like he was above others, and that rubbed Greg the wrong way. There were also stories floating around that Orndorff didn't always get along with his peers backstage. He could be confrontational, and Greg was never one to back down from an argument. It's easy to imagine them butting heads over something small, match ideas, pecking order, or even pay, and letting it snowball into something bigger. Valentine also didn't appreciate Orndorff's attitude toward other veterans. He felt Paul could be dismissive of the older guard, and that kind of attitude was unforgivable in Greg's eyes. Respect was everything to him, if someone didn't show it, especially to those who built the foundation of the business. Greg took it personally. In later interviews, Greg didn't go into every detail, but the way he spoke about Orndorff said enough. There was annoyance, maybe even resentment, that never really went away. He acknowledged Orndorff's talent and toughness, but you could tell he didn't enjoy being around him. 5. Brutus Beefcake. Beefcake started out as partners and friends, but over time, things took a sharp turn. On screen, they were known as the Dream Team, a successful tag team that captured the WWF Tag Team Championship and had solid chemistry in the ring. But as their careers moved forward, what began as professional respect slowly turned into resentment, both in the storyline and, as Greg later revealed, in real life too. When they first teamed up, Greg saw potential in Beefcake. He was flashy and charismatic, while Valentine was the tough, no-nonsense veteran. Together, they balanced each other out. But when the time came for their split, things changed. In the storyline, Beefcake turned face, breaking away from Valentine to become one of the more colorful characters of the late 1980s. To fans, it was just wrestling drama. To Greg, it felt like something deeper. He didn't like the way Brutus transitioned into a cartoonish act, and he never fully respected the direction his career took afterward. Greg Valentine prided himself on being a serious wrestler, a hard-hitting technician who let his work speak for itself. Watching Beefcake turn into a gimmick-heavy, scissors-swinging babyface felt ridiculous to him. Over the years, Greg even made comments implying that Beefcake's success came less from talent and more from his close friendship with Hulk Hogan. That connection to Hogan was something Greg often brought up when discussing Beefcake's career. hinting that Brutus got opportunities others didn't simply because of who he knew. Behind the scenes, that tension grew stronger. Hogan's influence in the industry was massive, and Brutus benefited from it repeatedly, from high-profile appearances to big comebacks. Greg, who had to grind his way through every promotion without such help, didn't appreciate that kind of favoritism. In his eyes, Brutus hadn't earned it the hard way. He even called out how Hogan would constantly push to get his friend more TV time or matches, which Greg found unfair to the rest of the roster. Despite their history as partners, Valentine's later interviews showed that the respect between them faded long ago. And that wraps up today's video. Make sure to hit like and subscribe so you never miss an update.